American Lung Association. We're very excited during Lung Cancer Awareness Month to kick off our Lung Cancer Patient Virtual Meetup on the Go series. Today's program is Clinical Trials in Lung Cancer, What to Expect. I want to take the time to acknowledge and say thank you to today's program sponsor, Advent Health in Orlando, Florida, for their continued support on many important lung cancer education and awareness programs like today. We created the Lung Cancer Patient Virtual Meetup on the Go series in response to feedback from many of you and our lung cancer patient community. We asked folks what they wanted to learn more about and how they wanted to hear it. And unanimously, folks wanted the opportunity to do registration for programs like today, but have the opportunity to view them on demand. So all of our programs in this virtual Meetup on the Go series will have the capability of individuals to watch it after the program on demand. So each of you will receive invitations to view all of the programs on demand. A few housekeeping items for today's program. It is being recorded and all the participants are in mute-only mode. We're going to use the chat feature for you to ask your questions. You will see that feature on the right-hand side of the screen. You just type in your questions and we will have them answered. If we do run out of time, we will follow up with Dr. Socinski to answer your questions and we'll send you the response. At this time, it is my privilege and honor to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Mark Socinski is the Executive Medical Director of Advent Health Cancer Institute in Orlando, Florida. He received his medical degree from the University of Vermont College of Medicine. His postdoctoral training included an internship and residency in internal medicine at the Beth Israel Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and a medical oncology fellowship at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Harvard Medical School. He was most recently the director of the lung cancer section at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, clinical associate director of the University of Pittsburgh Lung Cancer SPORE, co-director of UPMC Lung Cancer Center of Excellence, and co-leader of the lung cancer program at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute. He holds memberships in numerous professional organizations and is the co-chair of the Thoracic Steering Committee for the National Cancer Institute. In addition, he is well-published in peer-reviewed literature and outstanding journals such as the Journal of Clinical Oncology, the Journal of Thoracic Oncology, Cancer, and Lancet Oncology. His primary research interest resides in all aspects of clinical trials related to thoracic oncology population. He has also been instrumental in the development of many cooperative group and investigator-initiated clinical trials. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Socinski. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody. Thanks for having me. And I agreed to do this because clinical trials are kind of near and dear to my heart. Just to give you a bit more background on myself, as was mentioned, I did my oncology training at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston, Massachusetts, actually now many moons ago. And one of the inspirational things that I think we get in the training of oncologists is the process of clinical trials and how important they are. I subsequently spent most of my career, the longest duration of my career, at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, leading their lung cancer, what we call the multidisciplinary thoracic oncology program. We did many investigator-initiated trials in collaboration with our colleagues in radiation oncology and surgery, as well as pulmonology. And then in 2011, I moved to the University of Pittsburgh that was mentioned, and where I helped lead their lung cancer program for about just over 5 years or so. As noted on the slide, I'm now the Executive Medical Director of the Advent Health Cancer Institute, so that brings with it a number of different responsibilities, but my professional passion is still lung cancer. I've done it for 30 years. It's all I've done in terms of my clinical interest, seeing patients, as well as my efforts in clinical investigation have really been focused in lung cancer. I haven't, when I was asked to do this kind of what to expect, I didn't do anything fancy. I just kind of put a bunch of slides together that kind of reflected my thoughts on, what you can expect from a lung cancer clinical trial. And one of the things I point out to my patients on a routine basis, in fact, I did it yesterday in my clinic, is the making sure that we understand that today's standard of care, cancer treatments, were yesterday's clinical trials. And so we also have to realize that although we have made advances in clinical trials and in therapies, and I will remind people on the call that in the last year we had cancer mortality statistics was 2017. And in the year 2017, we saw the greatest reduction on an annual basis in cancer mortality than had ever been seen before. And what was leading that reduction in cancer mortality were really two cancers, lung cancer and melanoma. And so our efforts in defining a better standard of care are translating into longer survival, better outcomes for patients. And having said all of that, far too many people still succumb to this disease. And so we need to keep that process of going. And I would argue that today's clinical trials are tomorrow's state-of-the-art standard of care treatment. So that's kind of the philosophy that we need to embrace with regard to clinical trials. And again, I think it's very important for patients to understand that when I sit down, as I did yesterday, and tell them what the standard of care is, that I'm really building most of that standard of care, if not all of that standard of care, off of clinical trials that were done in the past. One of the things that I forgot to mention at the beginning of this, I believe I'm here to really serve a purpose to help the participants understand clinical trials, and if they have questions about clinical trials, I would like this to be as interactive as possible. I know we've asked you to submit questions through the chat. We will try to address all of those, or at least as many as we can at the end. But please, I'm very open to questions, and even if questions come up, I'm happy to be interrupted in the flow here. So let's keep it relatively low key, and however we all want to do that. So having said all that, what are actual clinical trials? Well, simply put, they're research studies that involve people. People with cancer can be obviously clinical trials in other disease sites such as cardiology and others, neurology, so on and so forth. And the goal of the clinical trial is to really find new ways to improve treatment and or the quality of life for patients with cancer. And trials, clinical trials may involve treatment. They may involve early diagnosis. We've seen the adoption of lung cancer screening as an accepted paradigm that saves lives nowadays. Obviously, that was done in several clinical trials. Trials may involve prevention strategies, and trials may involve symptom or side effect management. So there's a broad spectrum of what clinical trials may involve in lung cancer as well as other cancers. So if we go to the next slide. It's also important to realize why these trials are important. As I've mentioned, when a patient takes part in a clinical trial, they really add to our knowledge and improve cancer care for the future. I'd like to believe, and we do have evidence that patients do get benefit from clinical trials. And certainly we want to recommend a clinical trial that we think has a chance of helping that particular patient. And I'll come back to that in a few moments. And as I've mentioned previously, having done this for 30 years and seen lung cancer treatments changed from being relatively ineffective in the late 1980s through the 1990s to, as I mentioned before, in 2017, seeing the greatest reduction in lung cancer mortality than we've seen. That's all been accomplished through diligent, dedicated study in clinical trials about new therapies. And so most of my current recommendations are based on results of clinical trials that were done in the past. So I like to instill in my patients and in myself that there's a sense of paying it forward, that the knowledge that we've gained is because of so many hundreds and thousands of patients who have participated in clinical trials in the past. And we need to kind of pay that forward and keep that process going because, again, we want to get to where we cure all the cancers in the future. Obviously, that's a very lofty goal, but certainly we aren't going to do it unless we test in a rigorous fashion new therapies that we think are good ideas. Next slide. Now, it's important to understand the phases of clinical trials. The clouds don't just part and tell you how to use a new drug. Obviously, a lot of the new therapies we have are worked up in preclinical studies and in animal models, but at some point you need to introduce them into a human. We use the term first in human studies. These are also typically referred to as early phase or phase 1 trial. Obviously, these trials are usually relatively conservatively designed to start with a relatively low dose. We think potentially an effective dose based on preclinical experiments in animal models, but then work up to what we think is the appropriate dose, as well as schedule. Obviously, some drugs are best given every 3 weeks, some are weekly, some are given over several days. There are lots of oral therapies out there nowadays for various subsets of lung cancer. And you kind of get some sense of the safety of these drugs in the phase 1. So the goal of a phase 1 study is to explore the dose, what the appropriate schedule is, and what the early safety readout may be for that particular drug. Now, it's also important to remember that there is defined clinical benefit in phase 1 studies. ASCO has a position paper on phase 1 studies, and clearly they endorse the concept that even though we know very little at the time a drug is in phase 1 about its efficacy, clearly efficacy has been demonstrated in these sorts of trials. So once you've established the dose, have in schedule that you want to pursue, have some idea of the safety, then it advances to phase 2. Now, in the phase 1 dose schedule, historically, we used to allow any type of cancer to participate in a phase 1 study. It's become interesting over the 30 years that I've been involved in clinical trials that nowadays, since we know so much about the new drugs and what the targets of the new drugs are and what patient may benefit from the new drugs, many of the phase 1 trials are disease specific. For instance, we will do a phase 1 trial in a lung cancer population. Now, in the 1980s and 1990s, that was incredibly unusual, almost unheard of. We would put breast cancer patients, colon cancer patients, lung cancer patients, but it was a different era and a different time. And now we understand more about these sorts of things. So even phase 1 trials can be disease specific, but certainly what's really disease specific are the phase 2 trials. And this really looks at how effective really is the drug and get a better sense of what the safety of the drug is. You've established a dose and schedule in phase 1. You want to say, well, how good is this drug? And how much do we understand about the side effects and the safety and these sorts of things? And then ultimately, as I've alluded to before, we have a standard of care. You have to prove to me, because my job outside of a clinical trial is to make sure that patients get standard of care treatment that's been proven in phase 3 trials to be that standard of care treatment. The real question for new ideas is it better than the current standard of care? And that leads us to kind of a phase 3 trial where, for instance, a new therapy may be compared to the current standard of care in a randomized fashion. I think it's important that patients understand that whatever trial phase of trial they participate in, that there's a sense that they're getting at least the standard of care in these trials at the particular time in their disease process. So I think that's an important aspect of understanding the different phases of clinical trials. Next slide. Now, why do people participate in clinical trials? When you ask patients here, I always say participating in a clinical trial is a very noble thing. It's a noble thing mostly for the patient, but also for the physician. A patient has to trust their physician that this is the best thing to do. If you're in a randomized fashion, you have to be willing to trust the process of randomization, these sorts of things. But people participate in clinical trials to advance medical knowledge. Again, it's this sense of paying it forward. Possibility of receiving effective treatment or maybe more effective treatment. Someone recommends it as they trust. There's an old study from years ago that the number that was a patient survey, the number one reason that patients didn't participate in a clinical trial is their doctor didn't recommend it. So I very strongly feel that it starts with the doctor and proceeds from there. Compensation for time and travel, and then the experience, the research team, which I'll get to in a moment, but obviously a clinical trial patient is very closely followed because of some of the issues we'll talk about on subsequent slides. Next slide. Barriers to participation, again, lack of awareness. People don't necessarily talk about it. I think there's a general sense of suspicion about clinical trials because of the ancient history of clinical trials. So if you don't know about a clinical trial, you can't participate in it, obviously. And this is, again, gets back to why most patients don't participate in a trial is their doctor didn't recommend it. So I have a very strong feeling it starts with the doctor. You have to believe in clinical trials and make them available for your patients and educate patients about them. Fear that you don't know what the outcomes are, you don't necessarily know what the safety is, that may apply to some of the early phase studies. We're in a different era nowadays, as I mentioned before. Many of these drugs that make it into the first in human experience, we know a lot about. We know what the target is, we know how important the target is, we know that's an appropriate treatment for a select group of patients. And I think it's a different time nowadays compared to what it was like 25, 30 years ago. Physician recommendation, again, most people want to know that their doctor thinks it's important. And I hope all oncologists do think these are important. And then a level of inconvenience. And that's a reality, and we'll come back to that in a moment, and how we think about that. Next slide, please. Now, the other thing that patients should know is about clinical trials is they're very highly regulated by the FDA, by industry, by academia. And clinical trials undergo intense scientific scrutiny. It's got to be a good idea to make it into opening a clinical trial. And trust me, I've over the years, we have in most academic institutions and all institutions, the most common name of a committee is called the Protocol Review Committee. And the Protocol Review Committee will look at a potential protocol for scientific rigor. Does this make sense? Is it likely to be a good idea? Is it likely to pay off? Is it feasible? So when these ideas get to the level of a clinical trial, they've undergone a fair amount, actually a lot of scientific oversight, scrutiny. That's very intense. And again, all of these things are worked out beforehand. The other issue is that all of the clinical trials are reviewed by institutional review boards, so-called IRBs, for ethical considerations. Is this something that's ethically sound in that a patient should consider participating in it? And the other issue is that clinical trials are monitored in a highly regimented manner. When you're on a clinical trial, the process of collecting the information that's required within the trial is a highly regulated, regimented process, kind of, as I say, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So in the context of a clinical trial, patients should understand all of these things. High level of regulation from a number of different oversight bodies, intense scientific scrutiny to make sure that the science is good, make sure there are no ethical considerations. I forgot to mention on the institutional review boards or IRB, there's always lay representation. So we have lay people on the IRB, so we can get that perspective from someone who doesn't have cancer or someone who's not invested in the process. And then once you're on a clinical trial, they're highly monitored throughout the course of the conduct of the trial. Next slide. What should a patient know before about a potential clinical trial? Well, it's important that you understand what the current standard of care is, what the expectations in limitations of the standard of care treatment may be. You know, what's the new idea in the clinical trial being tested, and why might this new idea provide benefit in your particular situation? So that's you know, what I would advise patients to get a sense of. These are very legitimate questions to ask your oncologist. In terms of this, these are things that I go through with each of my patients to make sure they understand this. You know, it's kind of the process of informed consent for patients, that they understand what their standard option is, what the expectations and limitations of the standard options are, why the new idea is being tested, and why might this new idea be a good idea for the patient. Next slide. Other issues, insurance coverage. I'm a firm believer that insurance companies should not discriminate against clinical trials, but patients have to understand if there are any financial implications in what that might entail. Now, I can tell you that every time we open up a clinical trial, and this has been true my entire career, we are asked by the people that oversee these clinical trials what part of the clinical trial is considered to be above and beyond the standard of care that we would do anyway. For instance, if a patient had metastatic lung cancer and I was going to give them chemoimmunotherapy, we know what that would look like. We would know that obviously the patient needs that because that's the standard of care. And there's a cost associated with that, and there's insurance coverage and so on and so forth and all these sorts of things. What patients should not be expected to bear any financial burden from is things that are above and beyond that. For instance, we are testing some drugs now that require in the early phases of testing, phase 1 and phase 2, to do multiple electrocardiograms, often in triplicate. So you will see a patient that has to take a pill in my clinic, wait around for an hour, and then our clinical research nurse will do 3 EKGs over 10-minute period. They have to be separated by time just to monitor these sorts of things. That's not a standard of care. That's being done because of the clinical trial. So that would not be fair for a patient to bear the financial burden of that, and that should be part and paid for by the clinical trial. That's just one example. You can think of many others that may be out there. So important that these are vetted and make sure that the cost of these things that are above and beyond the standard of care are really part of the clinical trial experience. Next slide. Now, the clinical trial team is shown here. Every clinical trial has a principal investigator. He's the head guy or head gal. They take the responsibility. We have to sign a form from the NCI called the 1570, which says that we take full responsibility for the conduct of the trial and everyone who's involved with the clinical trial. We oversee it. We have that responsibility. We are monitored for our compliance to to the trial to make sure that the trial is carried out in a way that is expected from the protocol document. We have sub-investigators. The sub-investigators are there because I can't see every single patient that may be on the trial, so sub-investigators also participate in that, but it's really, at the end of the day, the principal investigator. Probably the two of the most important people would be the nurse navigator and the clinical trial nurse. These are people that are very important in managing the patient, very important for contact, very important to make patients understand what they have to do, when they have to do it, why they have to do it, these sorts of things. So it's a very important role, particularly the clinical trial nurse, whose job is to make sure that the patient is managed per the outlines of the clinical trial document, in that all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed, that things are done on time, things are done within time windows that they're supposed to be done, so on and so forth. So every clinical trial participant is tightly linked to primarily the clinical trial nurse to make sure things get done. Obviously, we're doing a clinical trial to generate information or data. We have data management specialists that are tasked with collecting that information. We have regulatory specialists. No matter how good you are when you write a clinical trial, undoubtedly you can't think of everything. So we have to make sure the regulatory stuff is in place at the beginning, but there are lots of tweaks. We call them amendments to clinical trials that our regulatory specialists help us with over the course of the trial. And they're also very important in that initial approval from the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. And then obviously this team here, this is an infrastructure that needs support. So when we do clinical trials, we do contracting in grants with either the National Cancer Institute, and a number of foundations, industry, and these sorts of things. So we have people on the clinical trial team whose specialty is contracting and grants, and help us make sure that the dollars that are there to support all of this infrastructure, as well as the stuff that may come along with the clinical trial, are there. So next slide. The process, again, I've outlined or I've said before that really starts with the physician. When I see patients, I'm constantly thinking, particularly with new patients that I see, but also patients that are going through the course of their disease. Is it appropriate that a clinical trial is considered? So you need to discuss this with your physician. I've encouraged patients, and I would encourage everyone here, it's appropriate to say to your physician, to say to your oncologist, is there a clinical trial that would be good for me? Discussions with the clinical trial nurse, the informed consent process, again, that's, I alluded to that before, that process is really a process of making sure that they understand the standard of care, understand what's being done in the clinical trial, understand the potential risk, potential benefits, all these sorts of things. That's kind of the informed consent process. I gave a informed consent document to a patient yesterday in my clinic, and the informed consent document was about 30 pages long. So you can imagine how overwhelming that, and that gets back to how much regulatory aspect we have nowadays. But I said, nowadays, if you were testing aspirin in a clinical trial, the informed consent document would be at least 30 pages, if not more, given the risks that we know there are with aspirin. There's always a screening process for clinical trials. Clinical trials have a what we call inclusion and exclusion criteria. We're trying to make sure that we understand the population that's going into the clinical trial, and is it the appropriate population? And so often that screening process involves repeat scans, review of pathology. Sometimes tissue specimens are required. Sometimes repeat biopsies are required, so on and so forth. So the screening process is an important process, but it really is doing your due diligence to make sure that this is the population of patients that's being addressed or intended to be addressed by the clinical trial. The protocol treatment is well outlined in any protocol document. Obviously getting patients started on treatment, we give patients a calendar so they know exactly what days they need to get their treatment, whether it's oral treatments, whether it's IV treatments, so on and so forth. Typically, calendars are built for patients so they have an understanding of what their treatment plan is going to be. And then how are we going to assess the efficacy? I will tell you in cancer medicine, our assessment of efficacy is mostly anatomically based. What I mean by that is if your tumor is 5 centimeters and it shrinks to 2 centimeters, we call that a partial response. But that's an anatomic definition. The technique that best defines the anatomy in a human being is CT scans. So it's pretty straightforward. We tend to do CT scans to assess efficacy. Sometimes in certain situations, there are these things that we call tumor markers we may follow. There may be other surrogate sorts of things we follow on blood tests and these sorts of things, but the primary assessment of efficacy is typically CT scan based. So next slide. Screening does take some time. Again, as I mentioned, with scans and scheduling and this and that and so on and so forth, typically the screening process could take up to a week or two. But again, it's designed to make sure that the patient is the appropriate candidate for the particular trial. And then, as I mentioned, the initiation of treatment is later. I'm very sensitive to the fact that I do not think that participation in a clinical trial should delay initiation of treatment in any significant way. But there are challenges along the way. As I mentioned, the process is a little different than perhaps what you might see with standard of care treatments. So next slide. So some of the myths that I just kind of thought about when I was thinking about this, that the treatment is experimental. When people ask me if it's experimental, I say I don't use that word experimental. Again, when you get back to what I said before about the scientific rigor in which these modern day clinical trials are put through, I prefer to use the term investigational. We have what we think is a good idea, good enough to get through the process of scientific review, ethical review, these sorts of things, and now we need to test it. And so it's really an investigation rather than an experiment. The guinea pig syndrome is am I going to be a guinea pig? Well, no. I think that would be the case if we weren't at a time where we understand a lot about these new drugs that are coming in. We also understand a lot about a patient's disease in this sort of thing. So the concept of being a guinea pig should be dismissed. I tell my patients in the clinical trials, this is a good idea for you because of X, Y, and Z. And sometimes the X, Y, and Z is about the drug, but sometimes the X, Y, and Z is about the characteristics of the patient. Most of the time, ideally, it would be both of those sorts of things. The other myth is that my doctor will be constrained in decision-making by the clinical trial. That's absolutely not the case. As a principal investigator and as a physician, our job is to always act in the best interest of the patient. And if you have to withdraw from the clinical trial, that's okay if it's in the best interest of the patient. I say to my patients, a clinical trial is not a prison sentence, okay? And if you think it's a prison sentence, then my role as the governor, I can pardon you from the clinical trial. We have that ability. All investigators and sub-investigators have that ability. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we act in the best interest of the patient. If that doesn't fit into the clinical trial, so be it. That's the whole point of this. I think all of us understand that. The issue about if you do the clinical trial, your options in the future may be limited. Again, it's actually quite the opposite. Many clinical trials limit the number of prior treatments that patients may have. And so it's actually quite the opposite. And so this is a phenomenon where I encourage patients to consider clinical trials that are appropriate for them much earlier in the course of their disease, because I certainly don't want a good idea to be not available for a patient because the clinical trial says you can only have 2 prior treatments and you've had 3 prior treatments. So those sorts of things need to be considered. And then, I guess another way to say this is the clinical trial should not be the last ditch effort. They should be moved much further up into the course of the disease. And then lastly, the placebo issue. I just had this patient yesterday when I was talking about a clinical trial, and it was a 3-arm clinical trial, and all 3 arms, 1 arm was the standard of care, and then 2 were good ideas that we're trying to do in a phase 3 trial. And she asked me if there was a placebo involved, and I go, well, no, there's not a placebo. Each of these arms is a good treatment idea. Placebo, so most clinical trials nowadays for many patients are really therapeutic trials for these sorts of things. Now, there is a role in a point of placebos when there is no standard of care. So in the past year in lung cancer, we've had 2 approvals in the adjuvant setting. The adjuvant setting is after you've had surgery for your lung cancer. You take it out, and particularly if your lymph nodes are positive, when your surgeon takes out the lymph nodes, we usually give adjuvant therapy. In an EGFR mutation positive patients, based on the ADORA trial, we compared osimertinib to placebo. It was appropriate to use placebo because the standard of care included, after chemotherapy, no further treatment. So the standard of care chemo was given, and then we were trying to test the role of osimertinib versus nothing, but we had to placebo control it because that's the best way to do these studies. We just recently, about 3 weeks ago, had the first indication in the surgical setting for adjuvant immunotherapy with atezolizumab. Again, surgery, standard chemotherapy, and then immunotherapy versus a placebo. That's an appropriate use of a placebo, but it's important to make patients understand why that placebo is important. So next slide. How do you find a clinical trial? Well, it starts with a doctor. You should, and I encourage patients, your relationship with your oncologist should be viewed as a partnership. It is your cancer. We have to act on your behalf in your best interests. It's okay. The doctor should be approachable. You should be able to ask your doctor anything. Ask your doctor about clinical trials. And I say that because sometimes patients, particularly a lung cancer patient, the average age of a lung cancer patient is 70 years. The majority are men. Sometimes we think the doctor knows best and so on and so forth. The doctor generally does know best, but knowing best needs to be explained to the patient. And again, clinical trials can be important. Depending on where you live, we have something like 70 NCI comprehensive cancer centers throughout the United States. Your local or regional or national cancer centers websites, and look for clinical trials that may be pertinent to you. That can be a bit overwhelming. All you have to do is go to the next bullet here, the clinical trial websites, cancer.gov or clinicaltrials.gov. It can be overwhelming. because there are thousands of clinical trials, and to try to find the clinical trial that may be appropriate for you can be a bit intimidating and a bit overwhelming, and this is where you have to rely on a specialist in your disease. And then lastly, the advocacy groups for lung cancer. They're listed there, the American Lung Association, Go-To Foundation for Lung Cancer Longevity, Lung Cancer Foundation, Lung Cancer Alliance, Free to Breathe. All of these advocacy groups have efforts with regard to finding clinical trials and these sorts of things. But again, it gets back to finding the right doctor and getting that recommendation and having that access to the clinical trials in your communities. So is that, yeah, okay, I thought that was the last slide. So I've done all the talking here, so I don't know if there are questions, but I will turn it back to our moderator to answer any questions that may be out there.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Socinski. This is Annette. We do have a lot of great questions. So I will read the questions and allow you to answer. The first question is, do most human trials start as animal studies?
Yeah, there's always preclinical testing done in various animal models, and that partly has to do with understanding appropriate dosing. It also has to do that many toxicology studies that are initially done on new compounds are done in different species of animal depending upon the drug. So you have some sense from those animal models about the dosing, a little bit about the pharmacokinetics. What I mean by pharmacokinetics is how does a living organism metabolize and process the drug? Is it metabolized in the liver? Is it excreted in the kidneys? You know, do we, you know, what are the issues there with these sorts of things? So there's a great deal of preclinical work that's done either in cell line models, but more importantly in animal models to help us learn a little bit about, you know, before you jump into the human system, you have some knowledge with regard to dosing and schedule and dose and potential toxicity, and a little bit about how you expect the organism to metabolize the compound and so on and so forth. So yes, the short answer is yes.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, so they're two together. How do you know when it's time to enter a clinical trial? And besides your oncologist, what resources are available to find appropriately scoped clinical trials?
Well, clinical trials, you know, speaking as a lung cancer doctor, clinical trials are really available throughout the course of your disease. I mentioned this woman that I saw in my clinic yesterday. She has stage 3 disease. We are running a clinical trial in stage 3 that involves chemotherapy, radiation, and various immunotherapy strategies. The control arm of that trial is the standard of care, what we consider the standard of care nowadays. And then the other 2 arms of that 3-arm trial are exploring different ways and different kinds of immunotherapy grafted on top of what we consider the standard of care. So a clinical trial can be right out of the gates. Your first treatment could be in the context of a clinical trial. If for whatever reason you weren't in a clinical trial, there are a number of clinical trials looking at a number of new drugs, whether they're targeted therapy drugs, whether they're immunotherapy drugs, and in some cases, whether they're chemotherapy drugs in patients who have undergone previous treatments. Now, again, I mentioned earlier that some of these clinical trials do limit the number of prior treatments one has, so you have to be a little sensitive to that. I think one should consider a clinical trial earlier rather than later in the course of the disease, so you don't get in a situation where something that may work very well for you in the context of clinical trials is not available because of a technicality on the inclusion criteria. You've had too many treatments for the inclusion criteria of that particular trial. So they can be at any point during the course of the disease in all stages, and they shouldn't be viewed as being accessed after you've completed standard of care treatment. Okay, the standard of care treatment is not going to go away. I mentioned that. Even if you participate in a clinical trial and unfortunately it doesn't work out the way your oncologist would like it, the standard of care treatment is still going to be there. It's not going to go away. You're not going to give up that option of the standard of care if you participate in a trial for whatever reason you may be participating in the trial. What was the other question? I forgot.
The other question, besides your oncologist, what resources are available to find appropriately scoped clinical trials?
Yeah, that's I assume people can still see the slide. It would be pretty much what's shown on this slide, whether it's the local cancer centers, whether it's the clinical trial websites or advocacy groups. I want to be careful about saying this because I want to make a distinction between some of us who have spent their life as really a subspecialist. I trained in oncology and I trained in all tumors, but for 30 years I've seen one tumor, lung cancer. It's all I do. I would encourage you to think about being seen by someone who does your disease for a living. You don't have to go there for all the treatment. You just want to make sure that someone who does lung cancer, in my case, lung cancer for a living, looks over the material, looks over the results of the test and so on and so forth and says, okay, I do lung cancer for a living. This is what I think we should do. And it could be a clinical trial, it might not be a clinical trial. But I would encourage finding a doctor who knows about your particular disease, because if you're doing a disease, if you're truly a subspecialist in oncology, you know a lot about what clinical trials are going to be available for patients there. Now, that may be difficult in some geographies, but I would encourage you to think about that. I mentioned, the network of national cancer centers. I saw a patient 2 weeks ago, yesterday, who, after he saw me, went to MD Anderson for an opinion. The patient I saw yesterday talked about the clinical trial as being seen at Moffitt Cancer Center today. So there are ways to access expertise in your disease that I think is important and could be a segue, a more effective segue to an appropriate clinical trial.
Great, thank you. I'm going to skip ahead to one question because it dovetails nicely, but I will come back to the previous question. Clinical trials previously were weighted towards more advanced lung cancer. Are there benefits for stage 1 and stage 2 lung cancer for clinical trials?
Yes, that is exactly true. Historically speaking, most of our efforts were in, for instance, stage 4 lung cancer. But once you establish the efficacy of a new treatment in stage 4, you want to move it up to earlier stages. And just take the most recent example of immunotherapy. In the past 5 years, it was October of 2016, so exactly 5 years ago, in which the first immunotherapy drug was approved as a first treatment for lung cancer. And then we've had a bunch of other ones in the past 5 years. But in the interim, what we did is take immunotherapy, and knowing it works in stage 4, we tested it in stage 3. We now have a standard of care paradigm in stage 3 that includes immunotherapy after chemoradiotherapy, which is the standard of care. And as I mentioned, then you want to get into the surgical population, stage 1, 2, and 3 disease. And as I mentioned just briefly, just 3 weeks ago, we had the first immunotherapy approved as adjuvant therapy. Adjuvant means following a definitive local treatment like surgery. You take it out. Many of these patients, actually the patients in this clinical trial, had to get chemotherapy before they were randomized to either immunotherapy or placebo. The results of that trial showed the immunotherapy would be better, is better, and that's why the FDA approved it 3 weeks ago. But that's a nice example of initial gains were noted 5+ years ago in stage 4 disease and moved up to stage 3, and now 5 years later, we have an indication for use of immunotherapy after surgery. The other thing I'll tell you is In the context of a clinical trial, we actually want patients to live longer. And so clinical trials take time to find out the answer. And honestly, I hope it takes more time to find it, because that means it's really working better. But as soon as we know something works, and in the interest of time, I won't go through it, but as soon as you know something works, then that trial can be stopped. Every clinical trial, particularly phase 3 clinical trials, have independent monitoring committees. And if the effectiveness of the new treatment is so much better than the standard of care, the job of the independent committee is to say, stop the trial. It's better. We can't allow patients not to get this anymore. So that's done most recently with osimertinib in the adjuvant setting. So that's another point that's important to make.
That's a great point. Thank you. Our next question is, how does one get to know the eligibility criteria for entering the clinical trial and the benefit from the advanced medical research?
Yeah, if you go, for instance, to clinicaltrialsgov, you will get more information than I think you might want to know, because they will go through the inclusion/exclusion criteria. So if there is a particular trial that you know about, then you can access that trial and look through the inclusion and exclusion criteria to see if there's anything there that's a red flag of any sort. That would be what I would do, if we're in a particular situation. Obviously, we have the clinical trial documents there. I often go through them. I went through them yesterday with the patient that I've mentioned several times to look at the inclusion-exclusion criteria. But if you're aware of a trial that may be important, you can get some great detail. Again, the website that I'm most familiar with is clinicaltrials.gov. You could probably work through your advocacy groups also, although I've not personally done that in the past.
And this may not be something you can answer today, but we most certainly can let the viewer get back with the viewer. Could you suggest resources in India to find a suitable match for an appropriate clinical trial for advanced stage lung cancer if the oncologist is not encouraging the same?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't quite know how to answer to that. I would have to defer that and get some follow-up information.
Okay, that's okay. The next question is hello everyone. How does one get to know? My father is 64 years old. He's fighting dual primary cancer, lung and tongue. Metastatic immunotherapy drug is showing some results on lung cancer, but not his tongue. Any suggestions for clinical trials anywhere in the world, especially India?
Well, yeah, I'm assuming this patient has 2 primary clinical trials. That's a bit of a challenge from a clinical trial point of view, only because the inclusion criteria for almost every clinical trial that I've seen historically has been to exclude patients that have coexisting other cancers. Yeah, so I think that's a tough one. Yeah.
And what are the risks and benefits of clinical trials?
Well, the benefits are, again, as I've mentioned before, the clinical trials are vetted scientifically, they're vetted ethically. In order to get to a formal clinical trial, in a short way, it has to be a good idea. So the potential benefits are that whatever the clinical trial is studying, if it's appropriate for you, that this may provide greater benefit than what's considered the standard of care. Obviously, that ultimately has to be proven, but that's the potential benefit from a clinical trial. The risk of clinical trials are related to whatever the potential side effects are, or the risk that the new therapy wouldn't work or doesn't work. And of course, but that's the same with standard of care. We have our standard of care options. Again, all of these have come from prior clinical trials. and standard of care is there because it was better than what we used to have. But again, we're doing more trials. So the risk and benefit of a clinical trial really is not hugely different in most situations than what I would consider the risk and benefit of standard of care is.
Great, thank you. And the final question is, what should individuals expect in a clinical trial? What does it, for someone who's never done it before, what should they expect?
Again, participation in a clinical trial is a noble thing for a patient to do. You put the trust in your team of physicians. It starts with your oncologist. It extends to trusting the team that surrounds you. You get a nice network or infrastructure, if you will, of the clinical trial nurse. Many of these clinical trials have pharmacists attached to them. The entire team sees you on a daily, whenever you come for visits. And so there's a community of different specialties: the physician, the clinical trial nurse, the data manager is often involved. A pharmacist may be tagged to it. And there's that sense of a team that's looking over you and really is looking over you in dotting all the I's, because, it's everyone's responsibility to make sure that there is no deviation from the clinical trial treatment protocol. And that's should be reassuring to patients in terms of being managed in that context.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much for today's program. This was very valuable. The exciting part about today's program, it is being recorded, and we will be showing this program throughout the month of November and December for other lung cancer patients and caregivers who'd like to review this content. We had the slide on the screen for those who do it virtual. If you do have questions, you can either email them to me, and I'll make sure to get them to Dr. Socinski, and he will be able to answer those questions for you. Next slide. I just want to remind folks that we do have another live event, and that event is on Thursday, November 18th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. And the program is an update on immunotherapy for lung cancer patients. And Dr. Sater from the Cleveland Clinic and Carol Robert Weissman Cancer Center, he will cover current immunotherapy options for lung cancer, when the options are used, and managing potential side effects. You will also receive, as a follow-up from me, we do have an on-demand video of a program that has already occurred. It's called Oncology Massage and Lung Cancer. So we're very excited to provide this option for folks, and we hope that it is beneficial to receive the on-demand videos. Next slide. In closing, I just want to do a little bit of a reminder of some of the resources that you can find with the American Lung Association. As you mentioned, we do have, for clinical trials, you can go to lung.org/clinical trials. We do partner with Immerman's Angels, and we have a mentorship program. And if you are looking to receive a lung cancer mentor, or you would like to become a mentor to a patient or a caregiver with lung cancer, please visit lung.org/cancer mentor. We have online support communities, and our helpline is very helpful. We have a staff of health professionals that can help answer any questions that you may have. And again, our COVID resources is lung.org/COVID-19. We'll be sending this to you in a thank you email. So this ends today's program, and we do appreciate all of your attendance, and we look forward to any questions you may have. And again, thank you, Dr. Socinski, and we appreciate the effort and the great information you gave to us. Thank you.